This is Bible 1315, Biblical Worldview 1, and this particular lecture is a review or going over the main subject matter of the textbook's chapter 3. The textbook follows a theme of narrative. The Bible is truly a collection of hundreds of, if not thousands, of individual stories that go to make the various individual pieces of the overarching big story that the Bible is all about. The writers of the textbook are using alliteration, some titles to help remember this quick survey that we're making through the Old Testament. And it is a story, the Bible, that begins from the beginning of everything. Truly, in the beginning, God, the way the Bible begins with Genesis 1 and verse 1, is before there is anything. So the creation of the universe, the creation of the world that we live in, and the creation of mankind as well. And that's the first C word. The second one is crisis, of course. It comes so quick, so unexpectedly in so many ways. The crisis is, of course, the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and then the continued disobedience of descendants of theirs as well. The next C that was used brought us to the time of a covenant, that is, to the figure of Abraham, to the beginning of the called out people, the people that God chooses, the descendants of one man by the name of Abraham. And that was a story of covenant, of one-sided promises that are made in response to a reaction. And we come now to another chapter, and the C word that they're using, the alliteration, is calling out, which of course takes us to the time of another great pillar in the many stories, a big fundamental pillar story in among the many stories in the Bible and the Old Testament, calling out, and of course it applies to Moses, and we are in Egypt. A quick review might be necessary. We covered last time the life and the activities and stories surrounding Abraham, the father of the Hebrew people. The time of the creation of the world, indeed of the universe, I cannot set for sure. What I can begin as your instructor to feel comfortable about is placing the existence of the patriarch of the Hebrew people, Abraham. That is a life that I have placed around 2000 before Christ. For testing purposes, please keep that in mind. Again, it is not about specific birth dates and death dates. We don't know those, and they didn't do birthdays back then, but around the second millennium before Christ, so around 4,000 years ago, a patriarch by the name of Abraham left Ur and settled in the promised land, what we call Palestine, and that is fairly secure. Again, you can push it or pull it back by a century, and we're still okay with that. That's as specific as we can get. And of course, then follow his son Isaac, the son Jacob, and then we left off at the end of the book of Genesis with Joseph, and we were in Egypt. Remember that Joseph was sold into Egypt, but his brothers and the rest of the descendants of Abraham joined him in this magical land that was an epicenter of power and of wealth in the ancient times because of a famine that was in the promised land. And we now move 430 years later from the time of Abraham, so to speak. The Exodus is what this chapter is about. It's about a specific moment in the Exodus, not about all of it. And that may be a word that's familiar or not to you, but it is, of course, the title of the second book of the Pentateuch, of the first 5 of the Old Testament. And there is where I'm going to go ahead as your instructor, point you to where we are century-wise in time. We're about 3,500 years ago, in the 15th century before Christ. That's your instructor's take. I will deal more with the dating of the Exodus in the next short lecture. We'll talk about alternatives, or an alternative that is given by some scholars, but as your instructor, we'll go ahead and go with 15th century before Christ. So there's about 5 centuries of distance, a space of time between Abraham and Moses, 2 important pillars in the history of the world and of the Hebrew people, of course. When we open up in the 15th century before Christ, we are in Egypt, and the descendants of Abraham are in captivity. They're a slave nation. While Joseph, if we left him back 4 centuries before, or 3 centuries before, was the vizier, the right-hand man of Pharaoh, and therefore had major power to influence for good. When we check back with the descendants of Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham 3.5 centuries later, we find them as a slave nation. They are no longer in favor with Pharaoh. They are required to work hard to make the construction material bricks with hay for the massive building projects of pharaohs of Egypt. I won't take that right now to take us to some of the amazing structures that the Egyptians are responsible for and left in the deserts of the plateau of Giza outside of Cairo today. But they're of course called the Great Pyramids. They rise 470, 480 feet up in the air. Those are the tallest structures, architectural structures in antiquity. And indeed, until modern times. You have to wait till the Eiffel Tower in Paris, made out of steel, in the 19th century before man builds anything higher than the pyramids of Cheops and Khufu on the Giza Plateau. The Egyptians were truly amazing builders. And in the 15th century before Christ, which ironically is 1,000 years after the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the Egyptians are still building massive structures, temple structures, and other things, and they have a large slave nation that has grown up in their midst for the last 430 years, and that are all part of the construction crew. They make bricks for Egypt so it can build. A few other things your text stresses: the tight connections that Exodus, the second book of the Old Testament, has with Genesis. There is a repetition of the phrase sons of Israel. Israel, of course, was one of the other names of excuse me, Jacob. But it is also now a nation, a word that is given for the nation or for the descendants of Jacob and Joseph and the rest. So sons of Israel is a term that is reused at the end of Genesis and again in the book of Exodus. But another important connection is those promises that God started making to Abraham, the father of the Hebrew people, back in Genesis 12, 15, 17. You see here a continuation of the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with Abraham. God keeps his word, God keeps his promises, even when man does not. One other thing, Egypt, the story is real. There's a real captivity. There's a real exit of a whole nation of slaves that gets up and leaves one day. There's a real Pharaoh that's going to drown a real army as well. There's a real Moses. But the story of Moses and the Egyptians is also an important metaphor, or the word Exodus is an important metaphor. It's not only a real Exodus, exit, so to speak. That's what the word Exodus means. But the Exodus is a metaphor, it's an illustration, and is a paradigm or prototypical picture of salvation, rescue in the Old Testament. So there's a real exit of people, and that real exit of people from Egypt is going to play out or be referred to, and it's definitely a dramatic foreshadowing of the salvation that Christ is going to bring in the New Testament, kind of like we saw with the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham being compelled to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loved. Well, we remember how that story played out. Well, God is going to sacrifice his only son. Here we have God saving the people of Israel, the sons of Israel out of Egypt, and God is going to do that in a larger version in the New Testament narrative with the function of Christ. So here, if it were just a play, and it's not, it's history, but there are three main characters, of course. There's God, who's been in the picture all along. There is a figure called Moses, as we call him, or Moshe. Moses is the ambassador of God to the most powerful man on earth, Pharaoh. And he's also going to be a leader of Israel. So he's going to be a leader and a lawgiver, as we're going to see in the next chapter. Pharaoh is the third character, of course. He is the most powerful man on earth, and the wealthiest, most secure kingdom to this point. Egypt has been around at this point for nearly 1,500 years. The first 1,000 years of its history, it never saw any threat from outside enemies. Only in the last 5 centuries has it seen some hiccups and bumps along the way. The highest moments of power of Pharaoh's was during the first millennium when they built those massive pyramids, but still in the 15th century before Christ, Pharaoh truly commands one of the most powerful armies in existence in the Mediterranean world, and is definitely one of the richest, if not the richest place in the world, and has a whole nation of people truly at his command and beckon to build and make bricks. Now, which Pharaoh is a logical question, because if it's history, and here I give you some names that are thrown out, including some that are not. We are not 100% sure of the Pharaoh. There are 2 involved in the story of Moses. One that won't let the people go until he does, and then drowns, and then one who will replace him. So various scholars and Egyptologists have tried to pinpoint this down, but Pharaoh is unnamed. Pharaoh is a title for the most powerful, the owner of all of Egypt. The Pharaoh has the role in Egyptian culture of the important role of owning all of Egypt and of maintaining the relationship of the land and the people that live along the Nile River with the divine, their gods. He's the linchpin between the human and the divine. So Pharaoh is not an elected guy, and he is that is a role that has incredible not only responsibility but power. Is it Thutmose II, and then the one that replaces him, Thutmose III? Is it Seti I, and then Ramses II? We will discuss that in the next lecture. But Pharaoh is the archetype of all things opposed to God. He will have multiple chances to know who the God of the Bible and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Moses and the sons of Israel is. He will have multiple opportunities to experience the power of God, but he will steadfastly harden his heart to the obvious because he refuses to accept that a slave nation's God is superior to the Egyptian man-made gods. So the first part you may well know is recorded in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 10 of the book of Exodus, and it talks about a new Pharaoh was in Egypt that oppresses the sons of Israel. They're no longer protected or in the favor of the Egyptians, but 430 years later a Pharaoh arose that was simply using them as slaves for the construction projects. So the issue of fertility, the issue of the children of Israel multiplying, being blessed by God with many sons and daughters. In ancient times, of course, there was much infant mortality due to disease and many other factors. It's hard to estimate how many children a family had to have a few survive into adulthood. But that said, please imagine a much larger infant mortality. And suddenly a slave nation begins reproducing quite exponentially. And so the plan A, to slow this down and stop this, because they could become a threat by the sheer numbers of them, is to work the Israelites to death, and that's recorded in the first part of this narrative. So the text says, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and work them ruthlessly. So the ruthlessness of the Egyptians increases with the increase of the population of the children of Israel. Here's a quick map of the what we call the upper part of the Nile River. The land of Egypt is a very unique people, civilization to grow up in the ancient Near East, and of course this was in North Africa. It's a civilization that grew up around a very unique, massive water highway called the Nile River to this day. The Nile River is unique in that it is the only major river that goes from south to north. All other major rivers in the world, geographically speaking, go from north to south. And instead, the Nile is the opposite. When it comes together, the blue and the white Nile from the central part of Africa, and then it rolls through Africa, North Africa, and then it breaks up into a delta. And so you see in this picture, in this map, the breaking up of the Nile River as it heads into the Mediterranean Sea and empties out into the Mediterranean Sea. That delta area where the Nile breaks up is highly lush, highly fertile. It's the most inhabited part of Egypt. In the rest of Egypt, you can't go very far from the Nile River, from water. Man cannot live without water, fresh water. And thus, most of Egypt below that huddles around no more than 8 miles from the Nile River, because there's deserts on both sides. The Sahara Desert on the left and other deserts to the right. And so that's one of the reasons the Egyptian civilization was one of the safest in the world from outside attacks. It had desert to the left, desert to the right, cataracts to the south, and the Mediterranean Sea to the north. So it had natural geographical protections. Now the 2 dots you see on the map are where Pithom and Ramses, 2 storehouses of Pharaoh were, and that's where it is supposed that the large and growing nation of the sons of Israel lived and worked and ruthlessly was worked to death, so to speak. Now, if you go back where the Nile starts splitting up and you find not just Cairo, which is the modern-day capital of Egypt, but if you will find also Memphis, that's where the capital back in ancient times were, Palace of Pharaoh, things like that. You will also find the word Giza among all those dots huddled around the Nile River, and that's where the pyramids, the Great Pyramids, were built 1,000 years before this story takes place. So the Egyptians live in palaces and around the Nile River before it breaks up into the delta. Well, the sons of Israel are up to the right side, inhabiting a large area and creating the bricks with which the Egyptians build their massive structures. Plan B, when Plan A doesn't work, is that they're going to order the midwives, Egyptian midwives, to kill all the newborn Israelite boys at birth. Stop the male population by killing off the boys and allow only girls. They got to slow down the rapid increase in numbers of the sons of Israel. Exodus 1 verse 16. When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live, so God was kind to the midwives and he gave them families of their own. So we have those who were in direct contact with the Hebrew people and their pregnant women, picking up the fear of God, of Yahweh, of the Jews, and not following the Pharaoh's orders, and thus we have a problem. God, in the meanwhile, rewards the midwives with prosperous families of their own. So Pharaoh and Egypt has to resort to Plan C. The command comes to throw all newborn Israelite boys into the Nile River. So now it's going to be the henchmen of the Egyptian power that are going to come to the villages in the area of Pithom, Ramses, and Sukkoth, where the children of Israel live and work, and they're going to throw them into the Nile River. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Remember this atrocious, just inconceivable order of Pharaoh, as God is going to come and is going to himself bring the death of newborn or of firstborn sons. Please remember that it is Pharaoh who gives this inconceivable order, not God who gives this order. Is Pharaoh, who has no value in human life whatsoever. Pharaoh, of course, does not give life, but he does take away life. He is the one that institutes this plan, out of which, of course, begins the story of Moshe, the one who survived this order. So Moses is going to survive. He's going to be placed by his older sister into a basket and going to float down the Nile and be picked up by the daughter of Pharaoh, and he is going to be brought up in the palace of the most powerful man on earth. Now, of course, the daughter of Pharaoh knows that he's a Jewish boy. The fact is, we know that when Moses is growing up, he knows he's a Jewish slaves descendant. Pharaoh may not know this until the age of 40. The life of Moses is fairly simple, laid out in he lived 120 years, and you can divide those 120 into three major parts. The first 40, the second 40, and the third 40. The first 40 is he's got the most fantastic life you could have. Brought up in Pharaoh's palace, educated to the hilt, cultured, spoiled, powerful, trained, all of the above. That's part of the narrative as well. And then, of course, comes the critical moment when things turn. They turn when Moses sees an overseer beating a Jewish slave, a Hebrew slave, and thus he reacts. Moses does have a temper. We find that out in other moments of his life. It's one of his faults, and he kills the Egyptian overseer, and thus he's exposed as a murderer of an Egyptian soldier, overseer, and thus flees out of fear. And thus, the next 40 years of Moses' life are spent way across the desert to the right side of the map you were seeing in the land of Midian. Takes a wife, has 2 boys, and he is then 80 years old when his life suddenly takes a turn for the different. Again, he has grown up in an amazing place for 40 years. He has been a shepherd in a desert for the next 40. So very contrasting first part and second part of his life, and then comes a third part. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, so there is Pharaoh of Egypt dies, and a new one. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. A very important item I will point out is that words like, or verbs like remembered, it's not that God is forgetful. It's just that this is the way in which we as humans can have it explained to us. It is an anthropomorphic term. When God changes his mind, God remembers. These are verbs and actions that apply to the humans. But and again, God doesn't have a back, feet, or hands, and he doesn't remember, so to speak. He can choose to forget, as powerful as he is, to, in a sense, delete. But this is where the children of Israel who have disobeyed and are in a pagan land are now calling upon him. And the promise made to Abraham comes back to light in light of the attitude of the sons of Israel, the children of Israel. And thus we come to Moses when he was 80 years old and in the desert of Midian. There's a burning bush incident in which God appears to Moses in this very unique, peculiar way. Now, God appears in many ways throughout the Old Testament. He appears as a still voice. He appears as what looks like the one patriarch Job as a tornado. He appears in light. He appears in a burning bush here. And the burning bush incident, where God calls Moses to serve him and do a job for him, gives him a job description for the last 40 years of his life, for the third part of his life, is an incident where we remember the words that are uttered. Take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. When God shows up in a dramatic fashion, theophany, so to speak, an appearance of God, well, you have 3 things, 3 major themes, whether it's a burning bush or other ways. You have the holiness of God. You're not worthy as a human being to stand on his ground because of sin. You have the presence of God, and you, of course, have the power of God, who can appear in any of the things he has created, any which way he wants to. He is spirit, but he can show himself to humanity, to man, in physical ways. When I go to the Egyptian, when I go to Pharaoh, Moses will say, he didn't want to go, by the way. He says that you got the wrong guy. I'm not the one. You need to choose another one. God insists. I know who I'm picking. He, of course, asked Moses, who grew up aware of all the man-made gods of the Egyptians, Ra and Isis and Osiris, and the list goes on and on of Egyptian divinities. What's the name that I'm going to use? And very important moment is how God introduced himself. And we talked about the names of God before in the Hebrew Bible, but here is how he says to Moses, this is the name you're going to give. And he uses the verb to be, and he uses it in the present, which is also implies the future and the past. I am who I am. I'm none of those gods that man makes. My name is I am who I am. That's the name. Now, we looked at, again, various names of God before. Elohim is the first name that appears in Genesis 1:1. That's the Hebrew word that's used to refer to God. It's kind of a generic word that simply translates God. That would be with a big G, by the way. Let me correct that spelling in your slide here. Then, of course, we talked about the name Yahweh, which is the four consonants with some vowels thrown in so you can pronounce it. It is more of a specific name of Israel, as we saw in the incident with Abraham and Isaac. God is the God who provides there on the Mount Moriah the ram as a sacrifice. I am who I am. That's the name you're going to give. That's what God says to Moses when he asks, what name shall I give? So this confrontation that we have, Moses going back in fear and trembling to where he ran from 40 years ago, it is a different Pharaoh, but he is going to the palace of the most powerful man on earth, and of course, his gods, the man-made gods, versus God. This is the confrontation we got going on here. That's what really the story is all about. It's Pharaoh versus God. And we have then, of course, the narrative that plays out of the various attempts to convince by force Pharaoh that he should relent. Let my people go is the simple and yet unacceptable message to Pharaoh. He does not need to take. By the way, the implied thing as well, the Israelites may have a God. They're weird, strange. They only have one God, but he must not be that powerful, since they are slaves and we own the world. Our gods must be better than your God is basically the implication. And that's what you have to see play out during the 10 plagues, the attempts to bend the strong will and pride of Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh over Egypt. Hubris is a word, a Greek word, and it's used, transliterated in English it's used often today too, and it means pride. One of the things that in the history of mankind are clearly identified as one of the major faults of mankind is when he thinks too much of himself. Hubris. Hubris leads man to make big mistakes, and he pays consequences for them. The opposite of hubris is humility, keeping your feet on the ground. And by the way, that is one of the characteristics of Jesus of Nazareth. Even though he was God, he humbled himself, even to suffer death, even death on the cross. Humility is the opposite of hubris. The problem with Pharaoh is hubris. What he says in Exodus 5 is, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Hubris, pride. Pride is going to cost the Egyptians dearly, and it's going to cost lives as well. And the Pharaoh himself is going to be experiencing that loss. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Throughout this narrative, God speaks to the sons of Israel through Moses. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. You're going to know that I am the Lord your God. He is trying to rekindle the relationship with the selected people, the chosen people. It's kind of like a formula, this is, that we see many times, that God uses in interacting with rebellious man that comes back and asks for help, which is the case of the nation of Israel, which is slaves of the Egyptians at present. The central message of Exodus is this one. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God. You will know that I'm the Lord your God. And of course, if you would think that they would only take one reminder, one experience, unfortunately, that's not going to be the case in the history of the Hebrew people throughout time. The 10 plagues are kind of outlined in this chart and the next one, but they do have a pattern, a very significant pattern. This particular textbook kind of outlines it as there's a plague. This is where you'll find it. Sometimes there's a forewarning on the part of Moses, sometimes not. The pattern kind of goes like first and second, there's a forewarning, on the third, there's not. Fourth and fifth, there's a forewarning by Moses to Pharaoh, on the sixth, there's not. It seems to have a very organized pattern. There's even times of day in particular plagues. On the first, fourth, seventh, there's a specific time of day that's mentioned, and there's even kind of another formula of Moses' interaction with Pharaoh. So it's very organized. It's not a chaotic, again, narrative. It's very organized, very impressive in the interaction that happens between Moses and Pharaoh. Here is the next set of, or the last set of plagues, 7th, 8th, 9th, and of course the most tragic of all, the 10th. And they are increasing in magnitude and effect on Egyptian society until, of course, you have the climax, the worst. Remember, as we tend to second guess, now how come God kills innocent children or grown sons? First of all, how do you find innocent in God's eyes, not our eyes? God gives life. God can take life. God tells us not to take innocent life, but God is the giver of life. Please remember the other 9 plagues as well that are an attempt to bend the heart of Pharaoh, and they unfortunately do not succeed, so that plague number 10 has to happen. So the death of the firstborn, which impacts, of course, the household and the life of Pharaoh himself. And that's finally when, in anger, and not in humility, in anger, Pharaoh cries out, "Get out of Egypt." The final call, "Let my people go," is finally finds resolution as Pharaoh lets the children of Israel go. Now, the point of the plagues. I've already told you, it's to bend the will and the pride of Pharaoh. But the plagues also demonstrate God's ultimate power over Egypt. Pharaoh and his priests think they have gods that are better than the Hebrew God. But that's not true. Their man-made gods that don't exist are no match for the power of the Yahweh. So the plagues demonstrate God's ultimate power over Egypt, power over Pharaoh, power over his gods, and the plagues serve as a sense of justice. Sometimes justice is meted out by God here on earth. Justice is always meted out by God in the afterlife, but sometimes it happens here on earth. Remember that Pharaoh killed Israelite babies for a long time before the 10th plague ever happens. So, what happens in the rest of Exodus, of course, is the hopefully known narrative to you. Your textbook quickly goes through it. We're going to rush in chapter 4 to Moses the lawgiver, but what follows after Pharaoh finally relents and lets the people go is that God delivers Israel, and then comes the second kind of post Exodus event, which is he crushes Egypt and its army, it's Pharaoh and its army, and that's narrated in chapters 11 through 15. The word Passover, the festivity of the Passover, the most important holy day in the Hebrew calendar to this day, 3,500 years later. Orthodox Jews, of course, still celebrate very importantly the Passover. That term refers to the passing over of the angel of death over the houses of the Egyptians and the Hebrew people, and sparing the Hebrew people's houses and their firstborn sons, and not sparing the angel of death, as ordered by God, the houses of the Egyptians. The Passover. This is where this, of course, is instituted. An 8-day, very important celebration of the way in which God intervened in human history when they were slaves of Egypt 3,500 years ago. The text says, Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go at once and select the animals for your families, slaughter the Passover lamb, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on top and on both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of your doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. So God spares the angel of death, but action is required. They have to not just hunker down, but be very specific. There's blood involved that will spare them, save them. Blood. Here again, see foreshadowing in the sacrifice of Christ later on. Blood is required. It's the blood of an animal, and it will be put on the doorposts, the entrance to their homes, or you could say, in metaphorically, the entrance to their hearts. Blood on the entrance to their hearts, and that will spare them from death. In this case, physical death. Of course, with Christ, it's going to be spiritual death. So very important. Again, many items in the Old Testament that are foreshadowing of the climax of the story of the whole Bible. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Again, critics or some skeptics look at this and sees a God of vengeance. But again, if you are the God of life, then God gets to decide when he requires it as well. And again, this is an important principle to be kept throughout what can seem sometimes later on battle scenes and whole people exterminated, and in this case, the death of the firstborn sons of Egypt. This is the cost of pride. Pharaoh and all the officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. So the loss of the firstborn finally bends the hubris, the pride, the power of Pharaoh. In the history of art and history of cathedrals. This one's in Canterbury, England, stained glass window from the 13th century. That is a story of what happens next, of course, when Pharaoh lets, and Pharaoh is depicted as kind of like a king on a throne here on the right side of this beautiful stained glass window in England. Pharaoh's depicted like an English king of the 13th century, if you see it. They had no idea what Pharaoh looked like or what kind of throne he sat on. And then the people on the left, all crowded, is of course Moses leading the children of Israel on the exodus from Egypt, leading the Israelites into their wanderings towards the promised land. Another beautiful image in the history of art comes from the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in Vatican, and this is a beautiful large fresco painting by Rosselli, and it is again another artistic rendition of then what happens next. As Pharaoh changes his mind, regrets having let the Moses and the children of Israel go. He sends some vengeance and leads him to get it in front of his army and chase down the children of Israel. And of course, you'll remember the events of the parting of the sea as God saves his people from the Egyptian army and Pharaoh by parting the waters in one of the major water sources of that area of the world, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture, where exactly might have this happened. Then as Pharaoh and the Egyptian army pursue across in the riverbed or the waterbed, the waters then collapse on them and they are all killed. And thus, very demonstrably, again, God demonstrates his power not only over Pharaoh and his army, but also over nature itself. He's a God of water and wind and whatever else it took to part the waters. And then, of course, bring them back on the pursuing army. Some skeptics try to suggest that maybe it was a tornado, some natural effect that parted the waters. Well, the miracle lies in the timing. That is, the timing made it so that a whole hundreds of thousands of people, Hebrew people, got across safe and sound, while the Egyptian army did not. So whether God used natural means or not, it's in the timing that lies the actions of God and the will of God and the power of God over nature. So the major themes that we have been through so far in your textbook: creation, the beginning of the story, and of course crisis immediately. We saw that in those chapters in chapter 1. Then there was in chapter 2 covenant. Covenant with Abraham, and that was important. The Abrahamic covenant narrated in Genesis chapters 12 through 50, the latter chart. And then the calling out. God steps down to fulfill Abrahamic covenant by rescuing, through Moses, as a leader, the children of Israel who've been in Egypt for 430 years. Your textbooks and your writers there suggest that we review things that you've learned, major themes, things to apply from this narrative so far. God cares for his people. God makes promises and he keeps them. And lastly, God's grace alone offers salvation. Grace is a word that, of course, will be used extensively in the New Testament, but it of course, appears in the Old Testament in the actions of God. God saves people. He 100%, they don't deserve it, but he comes and he gives salvation. It's a 100% gift, so to speak, and he's the only one that can spare. Last parting words. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." So in capital letters, these are placed the present tense of the verb to be, the most important verb in any language. And God is the present. He's always the present. He's always been the present. He's eternal. My name is I am who I am. This has been a quick review of the content of chapter 3 of the textbook.